everyone, and welcome to Healthy Vending 101. My name is Hannah Walters, and I'm the project manager for Let's Go South Carolina, an initiative here at Eat Smart Move More, South Carolina. Today, I am pleased to be partnering with the American Heart Association and the South Carolina Alliance of YMCAs to explore the case for healthy vending policies in South Carolina. Healthy vending is an issue that has been important to me personally since as far back as high school. I remember even then being baffled by the lack of healthy options available to students in school vending machines. So thankfully, we've come a long way since then, and as many of you know, the U.S. Department of Agriculture recently updated the nutrition standards for all foods sold in schools, including through vending machines. So schools in South Carolina are well on their way to improving the nutritional quality of the foods sold in their vending machines. So because of this, for this webinar, our focus will be on municipal and organizational healthy vending policies. In planning this webinar, I have had the pleasure to speak with many people across the state about healthy vending, and I have quickly found that this is an issue that is not just important to me, but to many of us here in South Carolina. Some organizations have already made changes. So for example, 21 hospital systems in the state have been recognized by the South Carolina Hospital Association's Working Well program for going above and beyond to create healthy food environments, which includes healthy vending. Also, the South Carolina Recreational and Parks Association offers guidance to local agencies on including healthy vending or healthy food options in vending machines and concession stands. And we'll hear more about some success stories in the state later in the webinar. And while there has been some progress around healthy vending in South Carolina, just one glance at most of the vending machines you see across the state, and you know that we still have our work cut out for us. So I hope you all are as excited as I am about this webinar. And before I introduce our speakers, I have a quick announcement. First, if at any point throughout the webinar you have questions, you can type them into the question box located in your webinar panel, and we will have time to address those questions at the end of the webinar. Also, if you have technical difficulties, you can type them into the question box, and we'll do our best to help resolve them. And then finally, the webinar is being recorded, and we will send out a link as well as a PDF of the slides after the webinar, so be looking for that. All right. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. We will first hear Katie Bishop, the State and Community Obesity Policy Manager at the American Heart Association. Katie has worked with communities across the country on healthy vending policies, among many other issues, and she's truly an expert in the field, so I'm thrilled to have Katie here with us today. After Katie, we'll hear from Chuck Steinfurt, the statewide HEPA coordinator with the South Carolina Alliance of YMCAs. Chuck works with local YMCAs across the state on adopting healthy eating and physical activity standards, and he will be sharing a couple of examples of local Ys that have made the switch to healthy vending. And then after Chuck, as I said, we'll have a Q&A, so please remember to type your questions into the question box on your screen. So at this point, I am happy to pass things over to Katie Bishop.
Great, thank you, Hannah. And are you seeing my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Perfect. Great, well, hello everybody. So I'm going to be giving a quick Healthy Vending 101, really talking about some tips for getting started on healthy vending policies, what to include in a policy. So I'm really going to be talking more from a healthy vending standpoint in localities, but definitely some of the things I'll be talking about would be applicable to organizations as well. Then I'm going to talk about good things to be including in a policy, how to put that policy in place to ensure sustainability, some tips for successful implementation, and then some examples of localities that have put healthy vending policies in place. So in terms of getting started, the list that I have here doesn't need to go in a particular order, but are just kind of things to be thinking about in the beginning of the process. So particularly when thinking about healthy vending on government property or local government property, it's important to reach out to the agencies that have a lot of vending machines. So in a lot of communities, that's the Department of Parks and Rec, but every community is going to be a little bit different. And of course, it's important to be reaching out to them early since they're going to be the most impacted by a healthy vending policy. So it's good to get their input and feedback, find out if they have been doing anything around healthy vending. And since it would just be starting the dialogue, you can let them know what your goals are and what you're trying to accomplish. If in those early conversations they are a little bit resistant to change, it just means that there's more of an opportunity to talk with them and move them along in the process to work towards getting them on board. One of the other really essential steps in starting out is finding any existing policies. So these could be, it could be an executive order or something at the community level, or it could be something smaller. So it could be that one of your departments has a policy around healthy vending. It could be that there's some type of voluntary initiative going on in a specific department. So it's important to find out what's currently going on, and then if there are any policies or voluntary initiatives, to get copies of those so you can see what nutrition standards they're using, what % healthy they've decided to use, to give you a good starting place to see what's going on in your community. It's also really important to identify where the machines are located in your community. In some places, this is easy to find, where there might be one office, like a procurement office in your locality, that houses all of that information. In other places, it is a little bit more different, or a little bit more difficult. If each of the agencies within your locality do have their own contracts with vendors, then there might not be a centralized location that tells you where all of the machines are located. But it is really helpful to find out where the machines are located so you know what the impact is going to be of this type of initiative. Also really important to identify the vendors that are working in your community. And this could sort of be going before identifying where the machines are, or it could be happening as a result of identifying where the machines are. Sometimes it's easier to identify the vendors and then find out where they're working and where those machines are located, and other times it's the opposite, where it's easier to find the machines, and then that leads you to the vendors that are working in your community. And it's also really important, similar to seeing if there are any existing policies in place, it's really important to look at the existing contracts with the vendors in your community, and this would also be really important for organizations. So to get a copy of those contracts, to find out the length of the contract. So if you've just entered into a 5-year contract, it might be hard to make changes right away, but you could definitely start those conversations with vendors to move towards making voluntary changes until you could make permanent changes. But also you should look in there to see if there are any provisions already around healthy vending. So there could be something about meeting specific nutrition standards, or there could be something about placement of healthier products, or needing to have a certain amount of the beverage slots filled with water. Those are just really important pieces of information to know about what's currently going on in your locality or in your organization. Also really important to reach out to the vendors that are working in your community, to let them know the changes that you're trying to make, to listen to their concerns, but also be ready to talk through their concerns. So what we've found in working in states and localities across the country is there are a couple of things that we tend to hear from vendors across the board. So one of those things is a lack of products that you could put in a machine that would be healthier items. Now this was probably true about 10 years ago, but there are many more healthy products on the market today. So there are lots of things that you could put in a healthy vending machine these days. Especially, as Hannah mentioned, now that schools across the country need to have healthier options in their vending machines, it's really done a lot to create healthier products for vending machines. So one of the things that you could do when reaching out to vendors and having those initial conversations with vendors is bring a product list of different healthy products that they could put in their machines. So in seeing that list, they can see, familiar brands. Even if they're not stocking the healthier options right now, they're going to recognize the brands and know that their distributor also has the healthier options. And then they're also going to see some options that they're currently selling. So it can just help them to feel a little bit more comfortable with making these types of changes. And there's a certain type of vendor that's really important to know about before you're going into these conversations, and those are vendors called Randolph-Shepard vendors. And the Randolph-Shepard Act is a law that was passed at the federal level, and it gave visually impaired vendors preference over other vendors for vending machine and concession contracts on federal government property. And every state except for North and South Dakota have passed a similar law, which we call Mini Randolph-Shepard Act, that also gives preference to visually impaired vendors on state property. And some of those states also give a preference to visually impaired vendors at the local level. South Carolina is one of those states that gives preference to blind vendors at the local level. So the first link that I have up on the screen there under Randolph-Shepard Act is a resource from the Public Health Law Center that walks through South Carolina's Mini Randolph-Shepard Act. So you can see what types of local government property the law applies to, and it can give you a sense whether your locality is likely to be using blind vendors. And the second link that I have there is a resource that really explains what the Randolph-Shepard Act is and gives you a good foundation to understand how it's helping visually impaired vendors and how it's going into effect in states and communities across the country. So it's important to have that background knowledge because as you're looking into the vendors that are working in your community, it's also important to figure out if there are visually impaired vendors working in your community, because you're going to want to have that information before you're going into meetings with them, because they might have additional sets of concerns that they bring up in those meetings that you'll want to be prepared for. So in terms of what to include in a strong healthy vending policy, at the American Heart Association, obviously the most important thing for us is that you're including strong nutrition standards. So for us, there are 3 different sets of nutrition guidelines that we think are good to include in policies. So that's the American Heart Association Food and Beverage Toolkit. The next one is the General Services Administration and Health and Human Services Administration Health and Sustainability Guidelines, which come out of the federal government. And then the last one are the National Alliance for Nutrition and Activity Healthy Vending Guidelines. So each of these 3 sets of guidelines are a little bit different, but they're all based on the dietary guidelines for Americans. So they would all be providing healthier options in vending machines. Another really important thing for us is to think about adding calorie labeling. Since with a vending machine, you can't pick up the product and look at the back of it and see the nutrition facts panel. Having calorie labeling just provides a snapshot so that folks know how many calories are in the product, so they know if it's something they would want to be eating for a snack, or if maybe it's more than they would want to have for a snack. Since we can't provide a lot of information on a vending machine, it does just give that snapshot to let folks know which options in the machine are the healthier options. And the next thing to think through is the % healthy that you want to choose. Ideally, this is going to be 100% healthy, because then all of the products there will be healthier. It also is a little bit easier for implementation and monitoring if it's 100% healthy. But currently on government property, we're not doing all that great, as Hannah mentioned before, in looking at vending machines in South Carolina. This is true all across the country. So the Center for Science and the Public Interest did a report where they looked at vending machines on state and local government property, and they found that 42% of the beverage options are healthier, so we're doing a little bit better there. But that really shows that in terms of beverages, you really would only need to change about 1 of the slots to get to that 50% benchmark. So because of that, you might want to be aiming to go a little bit higher than that. But if you did want to start out at 50% healthy, then it's not going to take you very much to get there. In terms of the food items, Right now on state and local government property, only about 15% of the options are healthier items. So this really goes to show that we need to be putting these types of policies in place because right now we're not offering many healthy items on public property. And then finally, I just wanted to mention on this slide that it's especially important from a heart health perspective to have the sodium and trans fat standards be covering 100% of the food products. And particularly with trans fat, though it is coming out of the food supply, there are still snack items that do have trans fat in them, which is why we would recommend having a policy that does cover 100% of the products for trans fat and then also for sodium. And a couple of other good provisions to think about when you're putting together your healthy vending policy are things to really nudge people towards making healthier choices. So especially if you're not going with a 100% healthy policy, the healthier items could potentially get lost in the machine. If they're in the very bottom row of the machine, folks might not see them. So it's great to be utilizing some of these types of practices. So you could do pricing initiatives where the healthier items are priced less than the unhealthy items to nudge people towards purchasing those. You could also use placement provisions where the healthier items are going to be at eye level or in very prominent locations. And then it's also really important to be thinking through promotion. So thinking about a vending machine, having the sides of the vending machine and the front of the vending machine be a healthier product like water instead of full-calorie soda. So that as folks are walking up to the machine, you know, they're already thinking about that refreshing water instead of thinking about the full-calorie soda. And some of the other things that are really good to include in a healthy vending policy are things like a provision that the contracts that go into effect after the healthy vending policy is put in place should include information about the nutrition standards, breach of contract information, and enforcement information. This just ensures that the vendors know upfront the nutrition standards that they're going to need to meet and what would happen if they didn't meet those standards. It's also important to include a provision about reviewing and updating the policy over time. So as we know, nutrition science advances, people's dietary patterns change, and the products that are on the market change. So it's just good to have something in there. It could be every 5 years. It could be every time the dietary guidelines for Americans is updated, but something in there so that someone is going back in and making sure that the policy is still relevant. Also good to include a provision around implementation so that a specific agency is in charge of making sure the policy does get implemented. And then finally, something in there around enforcement so that if vendors aren't complying with these guidelines, there is something in place to get them to get back in line. And so in thinking through how to put a policy in place, we really think about what we can do to make sure that it's going to be sustainable. So as we know, in localities, the administration changes, the folks on the city council are going to change, and also staff in the agencies will change. So it's important to put these things in place through policy or some other type of lasting change to make sure that they're staying in place for the long term. So the best way to go about doing this would be to do it through legislation, like a city council ordinance. Also a good option would be doing it through regulations. Executive orders can also be a really good option, but one thing that you'll want to think about with executive orders is looking into whether the mayor or other executive in your city does have authority over all city property. In some cases, like in Chicago, the mayor doesn't have authority over the Parks District. So even though there is a policy both for the Parks District and for the city of Chicago, when the mayor issued his executive order there, it didn't cover the Parks District. So it's just important to know if there are going to be any gaps, and if there are, you might want to talk with the agencies that are going to be excluded to get them to pass their own policy. And then the final option for us is putting the policy in place through contracting. So this would be more of a small P policy. But if you are choosing to do this through contracting, we would recommend that the contract be in place for at least 5 years. With implementing some of these types of initiatives, there can be some implementation issues right in the beginning, where it might take vendors a little while to figure out which products the employees in that community enjoy. They might see a slight dip in sales right in the beginning. But we have found that after these policies have been in place for a little while, those types of things normalize. So we wouldn't want to have a 1-year contract where all of those sort of implementation issues are fresh in people's minds, which is why we think it's better to have a 5-year contract so that any of those implementation issues will have been resolved and the policy should be going well at that point in time. And then I did just want to talk a little bit about some tips for successful implementation of healthy vending policies. The first is doing taste tests. So we've found that this can be a great way to, one, get employees and visitors to try new products so they could discover healthier options that they enjoy that they might not be eating right now. It also is a great way to identify the products that people like in that building or in that park so that vendors know which products they should be stocking in the machine. It's also helpful to do employee or visitor surveys. We've found that when these surveys are done, the majority of people do want to see healthier options in vending machines, and this can be a great piece of information to share with vendors to get them on board with making these types of changes. And I've also seen places that have done different promotional activities. So things like putting a sticker on the back of some of the healthier options, so that when a person purchases one of those products that has the sticker, they can redeem it for a small prize. So it can just be incentive to get people to try those healthier options so that hopefully they find some they enjoy, and then they're eating the healthier options moving forward. It's also really important to provide education to staff and visitors so they understand why these changes are being made. They understand the importance of eating healthy snacks and drinking healthy beverages, so that they'll be more on board with a healthy vending policy. And another thing to think about would be doing some sort of kickoff event. So this could include a short educational program at the beginning. It could include some taste tests, but just something to kind of kick off having healthy vending in your community. And then finally, I'd say to think about having an announcement to the community. So in some cases, you might want to try a more self-help approach of when the policy is going into place, not really highlighting it to the community, but after it's been implemented for a while, you've worked through those implementation issues, if there are any, then making an announcement to the community that things are going well and that people really enjoy the healthier product. And I did just want to very briefly mention a couple of examples of healthy vending policies that have gone into place around the country. There are many, many more than these three. The Center for Science and the Public Interest actually keeps a list of healthy vending policies on their website, and I believe it has over 60 places that have healthy vending policies, and I know that that isn't even capturing all of the great work that's being done across the country. But the first place I wanted to talk about is Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. Their Board of County Commissioners did put a policy into place in December of 2011. And then September of 2015, they decided to update that policy so that it now has really strong nutrition standards. So it is meeting the American Heart Association Food and Beverage Toolkit nutrition standards, and it's covering 100% of the product, both food and beverage items. They do have calorie labeling, and as I mentioned before, they have a provision in there to review and update the policy regularly over time to just make sure that the policy is still relevant. Another good example is Tulsa, Oklahoma. So they issued an executive order last July, and their healthy vending policy uses the GSA HHS nutrition guidelines. They also have calorie labeling. And they did a really great job of engaging their unions when they were trying to put this policy in place. So they actually ended up getting a letter of support from the firefighters union that firefighters in Tulsa really wanted to see this change happen. And that really helped to move the mayor to issue this executive order. And another really great thing that they did in Tulsa is they did do a poll of community members to assess, whether the community wanted to see these types of changes in public places in Tulsa. And the poll did find that community members did want to see that change, and that also helped to get the mayor to issue the executive order. And then the final one I wanted to highlight today is a more recent one from just last month, where the mayor in Springvale, Arkansas issued an executive order for healthy vending, meeting the GSA HHS nutrition guidelines, and that also does include calorie labeling. And so I wanted to highlight a couple of resources that might be helpful to you in your work. The first is that Voices for Healthy Kids, which is the initiative that I work on at the American Heart Association, which is a joint initiative between the American Heart Association and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. We will be releasing a healthy vending toolkit very soon. It should actually be up by the end of the month. So I've just included the Voices for Healthy Kids website there. But if you look back at that at the end of the month, we should have our healthy vending toolkit there, which have a bunch of great resources to help folks that are trying to put these types of initiatives in place. And then I've also included a link to the 3 different sets of nutrition guidelines that I mentioned. So the American Heart Association guidelines, the GSA HHS guidelines, and also the National Alliance for Nutrition and Activity. And then I did just very briefly want to mention that at the American Heart Association, we do work on healthy vending, but we also work on other policies to improve the food environment on state and local public property. So one of those areas is through food service, so establishing nutrition standards for the meals and snacks served in cafeterias, concession stands, and at government meetings and events. And then the other area is improving the foods available through institutional feeding, so setting nutrition standards for any meals served to custodial populations, like correctional facilities or state or local hospitals. So I just wanted to throw that out there in case anyone is working on those types of initiatives in their community, because we would be very interested in working with you as well. And I did want to mention that your South Carolina contact for working on healthy vending or service or institutional feeding, as I just mentioned, would be Yarly Steedley. She is our Government Relations Director in South Carolina, and she would be a great contact for you to reach out to if you do want to make these types of changes in your community. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chuck from the South Carolina Alliance of YMCAs.
Thank you, Katie. That was great information. So as Hannah mentioned, my role with the YMCA is I get the privilege of working with all the Ys here in the state of South Carolina with helping to implement our healthy eating and physical activity standards, especially with youth, but also just creating a healthier building for everybody that we serve. So before I kind of talk about a vending example, I want to kind of give some background to put some of this into context. So several years ago, when First Lady Obama was beginning her Let's Move campaign, she kind of put a challenge out there. It was all around childhood obesity, and kind of challenged different organizations and groups to respond, and we all have to do our part to solve this problem. And so the YMCA, along with several other organizations, were some of the first to put their hands up and say, okay, we're going to come up with an answer, we're going to help. And so not too long after, the YMCA of the USA, our national office, created what we now call the HEPA standards that we follow. So our Ys nationally, we serve over 9 million youth in different programs, so we know that's a huge opportunity for impact. So that's why we felt this was perfect. So we've always, as an organization, felt that we promote healthy living and that we want to do our best to make healthy communities. So this is kind of a way to put a name and some action, some call to action behind it. So not too long after that, here in the state, our CEOs across South Carolina committed these HEPA standards to make it one of our priorities. So we want to make sure that it's first and forefront in terms of what we're doing and what we're promoting. So in terms of what we serve, that's just a little snapshot there. We have over 50 YMCA branches across our state, which is 100 after-school programs and over 5,000 children every single day. So that's, again, going back to the impact. We know that we can do a great job to build healthy kids knowing that those healthy kids will hopefully one day become healthy adults. So the HEPA standards, there's a little bit of a snapshot there at the bottom of what that looks like. Those are some examples, but it's basically making sure that we are serving healthier foods, getting rid of some of the junk foods that maybe were served as snack times or meal times in some of our programs. Increasing physical activity levels, so obviously we want to get the kids moving and want them to be active. We're hoping for 30 to 60 minutes a day, depending on what kind of program it is, and we want to be able to provide that. Eliminating screen time. I think everybody on this call probably knows that children receive enough screen time in their regular lives, so we don't need to be adding on top of that. Providing staff training, that's one of the keys that we found around this, is that our staff need to be trained on how to deliver some of these things and trained on why we're doing some of these things, which kind of goes to the next point there, is about staff role modeling. So we want to make sure that, if we're telling our community we're doing these things, that our staff are also following them as well. So if we're if we're telling the kids to eat healthy foods, we want to make sure our staff is eating healthy foods. So to kind of take that a step further, it's not just the staff that are role modeling these, it's really the organization needs to model it. So that kind of goes into where our healthy vending comes into play, because this is one example that has come out of this. So our example for today is going to come from the Lawrence Family YMCA. And so they started this back in 2011, right around the time when the Let's Move was happening, and they received Lawrence County was part of the Pioneering Healthy Communities. So again, as I mentioned, the YMCA
Chuck, are you there? We can't hear you anymore. So bear with us for just a second, everyone. Chuck, we've lost your audio, so if you want to call back in, or maybe you accidentally muted yourself. Looks like Chuck is working to get back online, so just bear with us for a few more moments, everyone.
Hello?
Hey, we can hear you now.
Okay, I switched to the computer, so I'm not on my phone now.
All right, well, I think we lost you at the very beginning of when you were talking about Lawrence and making the change around 2011.
Okay, so I'll try to get you caught up to speed here. So Lawrence was one of our YMCAs that stood up and said, we want to make a difference in our community, not just in the four walls we serve, but obviously we're part of a larger goal here to make everyone healthy. So that's when this conversation started several years ago. As I mentioned, we always promote healthy living at the YMCA, so we want to make sure that we're not sending a mixed message by having any sort of unhealthy things such as vending machines in our buildings. The number 3 bullet point I put there, which I feel is probably the most important to anybody who's looking to make this change or to looking down this road, is educating our staff, our members, our customers, the people that come into our places of employment, to really create that buy-in. So nobody likes change in general. It doesn't matter what happens in life. We just don't like change. And so this is one example of, we don't want to be, people have habits that they're used to. We don't want to come across that, why are you taking my sugar away, or why are you taking my caffeine away? We don't want to have angry people. So really starting the education process, getting that buy-in, getting people excited about these changes, letting them know why we're doing it. We're not just trying to make your life harder. We're trying to make it better. So I put that in green as the one takeaway that I think if anyone wants to remember, really starting that process now to get people bought in. And then what Lauren's did is once they started creating that buy-in is contacting their vending representatives. So sometimes in a small organization this might be one person, sometimes in a larger organization there might be a few people involved. But working with who your current vendor is or are, and then talking to them about, these are some of the changes we're looking to make, and these are some of the changes we need to make happen, and making sure they understand that this is the route that we're all moving into is a healthier route, so that they don't try to continue to sell you on the high-end sugar things. So that's what Lauren's did, and they were successful. A couple examples of S5 and 6 as to some of the changes that they saw were, we wanted to, number one, make sure we're removing some foods that are high in sugar, high in fat, high in salt, making sure to get the unhealthy things out of there, and then replacing them with healthier options. So as Katie was mentioning earlier, how do we increase that percentage to have healthier things in there, such as adding things with whole grain, whole fruits, low sugar. And so I've got a couple of pictures I want to show you from the Lawrence YMCA, and these are kind of zoomed in as to what they offer now. So as you can see, we did a pretty good job of getting rid of all the candy bars, getting rid of the things high in sugar. Now we have things that are a little bit healthier for people. And I put this quote on here. This is from their wellness director. It says, people will eat what we make available, and if what we have is healthy, then we're doing our job. And I think that really kind of sums up this whole process, is we want to make sure in any of the work that we do that the healthy option is the easy option. And what we found, not just with vending machines, but probably in any other setting where there's a lot of food served, is if there are unhealthy choices, people tend to make those unhealthy choices. Maybe because they think it tastes a little better, maybe because it is a little cheaper, and those are some of the roadblocks that we need to get through and some of the obstacles that we need to not make challenges anymore. So on this slide, again, as you can see, that's kind of our goal, is if we make those options there for people, those are the options people will take. And Lauren's is a success story, and again, there's a little bit of pushback at first. So maybe there were a couple complaints a while ago, and now people are happy with the options they have, and people are eating the options they have, because if you are hungry and that's your habit to get food after you work out or to sit in the lobby somewhere, then those are the options you're going to eat. So I have another example I want to show. This is from our YMCA in Myrtle Beach. So this is a drinking option. So what they were able to do is get rid of all of the foods that are high in sugar, or I'm sorry, all the drinks that were high, replace them with low sugar and water. And as you can see by these two vending machines that they have, is that water makes up the majority of the options, and they have no problem selling the water because people keep buying it. And again, once you get through that initial hump of the people that are used to getting their high in sugar foods, everything works out smoothly and people are happy in the end. And that once we've educated them on why we're doing this, it usually ends up a little bit more successful, because again, all of our goal here, I mean, whether we're in the health industry or not, is to make a healthy culture of people. So anything that we can do, whether it's vending machine or not, those are going to all lead to successes in the long run. So I put my contact here if anyone has any questions or wants, whether it's related to our couple of success stories in vending or anything in general that we've done working with youth and programs across the state. I'd be more than happy to answer those questions. But I'm also going to turn it back to Hannah now, and I think she's going to open it up to just general questions from today.
Well, thank you, Chuck, and thank you also to Katie for great presentations. Just a reminder, if you have not yet done so, if you have questions, please go ahead and type them into your question box, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. I'm going to go ahead and get started with a question for Katie, and that is if she could expand a little bit on the mini Randolph-Shepard Act and what some of the pushback has been from the blind vendors in other states, and how have other communities addressed them? Because I know I've heard from a number of people here in South Carolina who have heard some pushback and have come up with challenges there, and I'm wondering how other communities have addressed that.
Yeah, I'm happy to expand on that. So yes, this is something that does happen all across the country, since, as I mentioned, all but North and South Dakota have mini Randolph-Shepard Act. And we have had some really great examples of blind vendors coming on board with these types of initiatives. One place was in Massachusetts, in their healthy vending policy, they actually gave the blind vendors an extra year to implement the policy, and that really did a lot to bring the vendors on board. Also, you know, Iowa has done a lot of work with blind vendors. One of the things that they did was really help the vendors to identify the healthier products that they could put in machines. And I think part of it is really letting the vendors know that you are there to help them in the process. And going back to your other question, Hannah, about what some of the pushback has been, from vendors in general, you're going to be hearing pushback when you're trying to change their business practices. I think that the blind vendors just tend to be a little bit more vocal about that, since they do have you know, other barriers that they're facing in their daily lives. The thought of making changes to their business which they may have been running for the past 20 or 30 years the same way, might seem a little daunting. So I think being able to really offer yourself as somebody that's going to be able to help them in the process and really help them to understand the nutrition standards you're using, the types of products that they are going to be able to put in the machines will really help to alleviate some of that.
That's great. And this is sort of a follow-up to that, and I think Chuck might be able to respond to this as well. But can you share if there has been any evidence to show that sales will not drop when switching to healthier vending? And Chuck, if you could also speak on whether Lawrence has seen any drop in sales or if they're continuing to see good sales with the new policy?
Yeah, the Ys that I've talked to, both here in South Carolina and also just across the country, that is always one of their initial fears, and some of that is driven by their vendor. When they say, hey, we want to switch out all the Cokes and Pepsis and put water, they say, well, you're not going to get any sales. And again, they're a salesman themselves, so we don't want to be hurting their business practice. So that's always one of the initial fears. But everybody I've talked to says that basically the sales flatline, and they don't necessarily go up, they don't go down, but they stay the same, which is, I think, a good thing because they're selling just as much food or drink. It's just healthier now. So I have no specific examples of sales going down, which I think is a good thing.
And Hannah, I can talk to that a little bit as well. And one of the things you might want to share with participants is a fact sheet that's up on the Center for Science and the Public Interest website. That does have some examples of places that have put healthy vending policies in place, and you know, they either see revenue stay the same. In some cases, they've actually seen a slight increase in sales by having healthy vending. And then there is an example on there of revenue decreasing in the first couple of months of implementation, but then going back up to where it was originally. And I really do think that in doing some of those successful implementation things, like doing taste tests and by doing some educational presentations so people understand why these changes are being made, that can really help with the initial implementation so that you're not seeing that slight drop in sales in the beginning.
Great, thank you both. And Katie, you had mentioned coming to vendors with a list of healthy products that meet the vending standards. Is there a sample list of healthy products that I could point people to?
Yeah, so there are a few different lists. There's one that will actually be up on the Voices for Healthy Kids toolkit when that's available later this month. That has products that meet all of the different sets of nutrition guidelines that I mentioned today. And then there are also, there's the Alliance for a Healthier Generation. Their product list has a lot of really great products that meet the nutrition standards that are used in schools. So those are two that the Alliance for a Healthier Generation is one that I often point people to, and then that new resource that I think is going to be really great for people.
Great, thank you. And I will share that with everyone after the webinar. So if you have any questions, there's still opportunity to go ahead and type them in. I'm wondering now for Chuck if, so it sounds like Lawrence is doing some really wonderful work. Are there other Ys in the state that you could give examples of so that some of our listeners might hear of some Ys that are near them that are doing some good work around healthy vending?
Yeah, there's a couple that are not as far along as Lawrence. I did mention Myrtle Beach is doing a good job. Some of our other smaller communities, Newberry is working in this direction. Greenville has always done a good job of trying to have healthy programs and be a big part of their community. So a lot of our Ys are in the earlier stages of making that transformation. And we have some unique challenges. We actually have a YMCA that is in an old Coca-Cola building where the side of the building still says Coca-Cola. So you can imagine some of the pushback we get from Coke down there. That's down in Somerville. But as more and more of the Ys are sharing the success stories, we're learning that this, it doesn't have to be ripped off like a Band-Aid, but if we can kind of build into healthier machines, we're actually finding that, even as we slowly do it, that we find that people are appreciative of it and they actually start liking the healthier foods and are asking the question, why didn't we do this sooner?
Great. I have a question here. I think this will be for Katie. Is there an example of a city or town that has had good success with healthy vending at parks and recreational facilities?
Yeah, so there are a lot of really great places that have success in parks. There's actually been a study done of a healthy vending change that happened in the Chicago park, where they actually saw an increase in sales by offering healthier products in their parks. I also know that in Annapolis, Maryland, they've also been doing a lot of work in the parks there, and there are a whole bunch of other examples where they start by working in the parks when they're making these changes.
Great, and as I mentioned at the beginning, the South Carolina Recreational and Parks Association does have some guidance for its local agencies on healthy vending, so I can share that with folks on the webinar too. And another question, and I think this was mentioned a little bit throughout the webinar, but can you talk about what the criteria for healthier options was in the examples mentioned? So Chuck, if you could talk about what criteria you used in Lawrence, and then Katie, maybe expanding on some of the criteria that you mentioned.
Sure. Again, I think it starts by reading the nutrition labels, and as I think Katie mentioned earlier, when you're buying from a vending machine, you don't always get the luxury of seeing that. So some of our goals are just looking at, are there trans fat, and can we offer foods that don't offer trans fat? What are the grams of sugar? And one of the markers that we use is we try to keep it, if possible, 8 grams or less on some of the snacks of sugar. And then with the drinks, I think, again, trying to eliminate anything with sugar is the ultimate goal. And some of our Ys are getting there. And the more water and no sugar options we have, that's ultimately what we want to reach at the end.
And for the 3 different sets of nutrition guidelines that I mentioned, all 3 of them have standards for calories, saturated fat, trans fat, sugar, and sodium. And then those are for the food items. And then the National Alliance for Nutrition and Activity, they actually have a positive nutritional value piece. So for those who are familiar with the SMART snack standards that are used in schools, they're very similar to those standards, where they say that in addition to limiting the negative contributions to the diet, they also say that you need to have some sort of positive contribution. So you need to have some whole grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts, something like that in the product. And then in terms of beverages, they all list out specific beverages that are healthier, like water, low-fat milk. They allow 100% juice, and then for other beverages, they have a calorie cap for the amount of calories that you can have in those, which, as we know, ends up reducing the amount of sugar that you can have in the beverage.
Great, and I will make sure that everyone has a copy of these slides, so you'll have access to those links to all of those nutrition standards and model standards that Katie mentioned. All right, just click through the slides there. And one more question here. This will be the last one before we wrap up. We've tried healthy vending for our employees in our retirement community, but needed to slightly increase the prices to $1 or $1.50 since our products were more expensive. It was not received well, and most employees were saying this was too expensive, and we ended up going back to unhealthy options and lowered the prices back to 50 cents and 75 cents. What are the price ranges that the YMCAs are charging for their vending?
That's a good question. I don't have that information right in front of me. What I do know is that we've had a couple examples where the current vendor who we're using has worked with the same exact price point as what the unhealthy items were as part of the negotiation process. Once they felt that we were making that change and we were committing to that change, they knew that if they couldn't match our prices, that we would seek another vendor who would, and some people even threatened that to them. So we found that during the negotiations we were able to keep most of the prices the same. I just don't have those prices in front of me.
And Hannah, I can add something.
Yeah, Katie.
So I was just going to say that in terms of the healthier products, there are some that are going to be more expensive if you're thinking about like a Kind bar or some of those types of things definitely do add an increased cost. But then you also have things like if you're going from a regular potato chip to a baked potato chip, that's going to have the same price. Or if you're thinking about a bottle of water versus a full-calorie soda. So there definitely can be things that are more expensive, but you can also find healthier products that are less expensive. And one tip you could do is if you are having some of the less healthy items, if you could increase the price of those items to offset an increased cost in the less healthy items. So that could, one, be moving people towards purchasing the healthier products, and then also it could make up any sort of, price issues if the vendor was having issues making up that money.
Great, thank you. Well, I did get one other question here, so I'm going to, I think we have time for that. This is from a viewer who said, on Chuck's photo of the Lawrence vending machine, I noticed that the top row had 2 empty slots. What are the most popular healthy food items in Lawrence? Chuck, can you answer that?
I don't have that answer either, unfortunately. I don't know if Bree is on this call. Bree Holmes from the Lawrence YMCA. She might be able to answer that. Maybe she can text that in the chat box. If not, I can definitely find that answer today, and we can send it out as a follow-up after this call. Yeah,
that's great. We can definitely do a follow-up. And Bree did say she's going to check with the vendor rep, so she's not sure either. But that's a good question, and we can definitely compile all of these resources for everyone and share them after the webinar along with the webinar recording. And then if you have specific questions for any of the speakers today, I've put our contact information here on the slide, so feel free to reach out. And if you have any other questions, that's where you can head. But I want to, again, thank our speakers today. Thank you, Chuck and Katie, for joining us for this webinar. And I hope you all have a great day.